All right, let me share my screen here and then let's get started. Okay. All right, I'm playing. All right, 3, 2, and 1. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play, and today we are talking about dismantling toxic masculinity at work. So let's get into it. So what we're going to be actually covering today is we're going to be delving into the impacts that toxic masculinity has actually had, and specifically toxic masculine leadership during the past 2 years. Then we're going to explore why this is important to the cannabis industry, address the myth of toxic masculine leadership, explore the balance of feminine and masculine leadership and how that actually looks like in a leader. And finally, we're going to talk about providing solutions for any level of workforce, whether you're at the entry level, retail level, all the way up to the C-suite level. So before we can begin, we have to actually define what toxic masculinity is, right? So the definition that I appreciate the most is toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating being a man as defined by dominance, aggression, individualism, and lack of emotion. Now, remember these because I'm going to be tapping into these in a moment. So what does actual toxic masculine leadership traits look like? They look like bullying. They look like avoiding losing at all costs, restraining one's emotions, showing strength through aggressions and moments of conflict, and exhibiting dominance, masking insecurity. Okay? So then let's go back to the pandemic, March of 2020, all the way to December of 2020. And remember how a lot of organizations and a lot of companies were treating their staff, because many of that actually resulted in toxic masculine leadership, right? So I believe toxic masculine leadership drove the Great Resignation. And here's the proof. At the beginning, you had organizations or you had companies that were forcing staff to go back to work, putting them in harm's way when there was no vaccine, sometimes even after someone had died on the job and they expected them at work the next day. We had other organizations, other companies where they were treating their staff so poorly, some started to go on strike. Then you had other companies that are actually taking PPP loans that was actually allocated to rehire staff that they had furloughed or laid off. And instead that money was being used to buy back stock, to reward their investors, or was being used to provide bonuses to executives. And then you had even companies like American Airlines that laid off workers around like July of 2020, and then 8-9 months later, wondered why there was a labor shortage, wondering where were all the staff? I can't find staff anywhere, right? This is what was actually going on during this time. And then you even had essential workers who were celebrated at the beginning of the pandemic and then later on taking advantage of, and even some employers that were breaking laws in how they laid off staff during that time. So this is all happening, right? All this toxic masculine leadership, and it resulted in many companies thinking that people were quitting because, it's COVID, it's the bad economy, when many of them were like, listen, it's low pay and I'm being treated disrespectfully, right? And that ultimately led to 47.2 million people quitting their jobs in 2021. 47.2 million people quitting their jobs, right? And that has continued for certain organizations now. So that is where we're at. That's where we're currently addressing. So how do we actually address this, right? So let's first talk about why this is actually important to the cannabis industry. So 20 years ago, the tech industry was at its infancy. And this is when there was so much hope, right? This is when people actually wanted to work for Amazon. It was the place where some of the best ideas were actually being solved. Some of the problems that we're struggling the most with in the tech industry were actually being solved, right? There was so much potential. Look, you even got Mark Zuckerberg with no shoes on, right? This is some opportunity. This is like the free for all, the fun times. And this is exactly where the cannabis industry is now. Now look how that changed when certain tech heads fell in love so much with their own BS and became way too high and mighty and forgot why they started these organizations in the first place and the impact that they could have. That is the opportunity that you have right now. So the opportunity the cannabis industry have is an opportunity to revolutionize the future of work, not just for this industry, but show that it can actually work in other areas. You can provide work benefits that other industries would never even dream of possibly offering, right? And you can create workplaces that are built on shared humanity. This is the opportunity that you have in front of you, and this is what we're going to actually try to break down today. But let's first talk about, like, who am I? Why am I talking about this? Well, first off, it is actually really important that a man speaks about toxic masculinity, because women have been speaking about this for decades, if not centuries, and no one has been addressing this, right? And it's us men who created the problem in the first place, so we need to actually address this. So who am I? My name is Jeff Harry, as I mentioned earlier, with Rediscover Your Play. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a toy designer. I saw the movie Big, and as soon as I saw that movie Big, I started applying to toy companies in third grade. I started writing them letters in third grade, and I did not stop until I got into the toy industry. And I don't know if you've ever gotten exactly what you've always wanted and then been so disappointed when you get there, but that's what actually happened. And why did I hate it so much? Because there was such toxic masculine leadership, backstabbing, people pitting it up against one another, people internally competing against one another, instead of recognizing that holistically we were working together to achieve a bigger goal than ourselves, right? So I remember leaving this industry, my dream industry, because of toxic leadership. I don't know if you've ever learned that, but it's one of the most devastating things. And maybe this is what a lot of Gen Zers go through right now when they get into industries and they believe they can actually make a difference, and then they're stifled. So I left New York, came to the Bay Area, and I helped to find an organization that became the largest Lego-inspired STEM organization in the United States. And the way in which I did that was we played. We had no business in. We picked people we thought were fun. We prioritized people over profits. We followed our curiosity. We focused on inspiring staff instead of intimidating staff. And we realized later on that what we were doing, we were actually avoiding toxic masculine leadership. And this is why our organization was successful. So when I thought of that, I was just like, why is not other organizations doing this, right? So we have to recognize that this is not an anti-men workshop. This is not an anti-men presentation. We are talking about toxic masculine leadership that anybody, man, woman, trans, however you identify, could act that way. I mean, we have the example of Jeff Bezos, but we have also the example of Elizabeth Holmes. Both mistreated their staff. Both were secretive. Both were quite cruel to their staff. And this can happen with any individual. So we have to be aware this is not anti-men. This is actually addressing toxic masculine leadership, the actual traits. So there's an assumption, right, that when you're a badass, right, when you're a Steve Jobs, you produce higher profits. That is just what happens, right? The data does not lie. And the data proves that that is not the case. Actually, companies with women in leadership positions are continuously more profitable, especially when you have women in director and executive officer roles. The top 40, in the Fortune 500, 41 of the top Fortune 500 companies are run by women. So clearly, when you bring in a certain level of diversity, especially gender diversity, you actually are more successful. So we have to recognize that. But in addition to that, toxic masculine leadership is costing companies billions of dollars. SHRM, the HR organization, did a study back in 2019 that found that $223 billion were being lost in the last 5 years due to bad company culture and specifically toxic leadership. Gallup did an even more concerning poll and found that active disengagement was happening because of a toxic boss, and that was costing companies 450 to 550 billion per year. This is a ridiculous amount of money that is actually impacting organizations, and this needs to be addressed. But also, this is very grandiose number. So let's actually get into the nitty-gritty of how much this would actually cost potentially your organization, right? So for organizations that have toxic leadership, Michigan State study found that every toxic employee costs companies $14,000 per employee. So if you have 5 staff, not counting your toxic leader, right, your toxic masculine leader, that might be $70,000 a year just for that one team. So think about that in terms of whole organizations, right? Then you have what happens when you have toxic masculine leadership. You actually have higher rates of turnover. And because of that, that can cost you 6 to 9 months of someone's salary, right? So if you're paying someone $60,000 a year, we're talking about $30,000 to $45,000 a year just to replace that person, okay? And then we haven't even thought about the possibility of lawsuits, sexual harassment lawsuits, in addition to other types of lawsuits. Potential litigation could cost between $75,000 to $150,000, and that doesn't even count whether you settle or not. This might be just the discovery portion of it. This is how much money it could cost. So what we need to recognize is we need to start embracing a new type of leadership that actually balances both masculine and feminine principles, right? It's important to have profitability, but also, especially now, and especially with cannabis, there needs to be a certain level of sustainability. Are you thinking about how are you going to make this organization last 5, 10 years down the road? You know, it's important to have some logic and reasoning, but also following your intuition and making sure that you are recognizing, rewarding emotional intelligence. It's important to have competition, but not internal competition, and focus more on collaboration within, and that you're not trying to control your staff, but you're trying to inspire and coach your staff to actually be better leaders in the workplace. And who are some examples of balanced form of leadership? 2 great examples is Jacinda Ardern, who's the New Zealand Prime Minister, who actually had the lowest COVID rates and lowest COVID deaths in the world. And how did she do this? By showing up with a certain level of masculine leadership, very clear, directive, focused on making sure, had a certain level of clarity, but at the same time was very compassionate, very understanding with her constituents. And that is how they work together to actually bring down rates. Another example of this is Dan Price with gravity payments. You might have known him as the person that provided minimum wage of $70K a year for his staff, right? He actually measures how many of his staff are actually having babies and staying with the organization. That's how he measures some of his success. So we have to be open to thinking about the holistic approach of how we celebrate leadership. What type of leadership do we want to celebrate going forward? And what type of leadership is antiquated and needs to be placed back in the past? So where do we begin? We begin by talking about the power dynamics that happen at the various levels, right, of leadership. So I understand that there's so many different power dynamics that we need to address, but everyone has a certain level of agency regardless of where you're at. So let's actually get into talking about what could happen, what you could do at the entry level all the way up to the C-suite level to start to address this toxic masculinity and toxic masculine leadership in the workplace specifically. So for entry and junior level staff, a lot of times you're like, ah, man, I can't do anything. This is toxic, but I have no power. I challenge you that. I challenge you because if you're able to find allies and employees who have similar issues, right, that also don't like dealing with this certain type of leader, and you start sharing your story and gathering other people's story, this is when you start to build community. This is when you start to build, like, do you have this problem as well? Do you have this problem as well? And I challenge this, that this is not just affecting women, this is also affecting men. There's a lot of men that don't want to act this way. There's a lot of men that don't want to act in a toxic way, and they're being told this is the way in which to be successful. And it's just not true. It's just not true, right? So then what you need to do is you need to be gathering data and documentation on these toxic staffers. You know, there was even one study where someone had actually a toxic journal who actually would write down all the times this person was actually acting up, and got some of his colleagues to actually log that information as well. And then they were able to take multiple toxic journals to HR, and they were able to let that person go. Okay, so there is power, there is challenge. Now also recognize that you have a certain level of leverage and access at this point because you are on the ground level. Let's say you're working retail, you know what is happening on a regular basis, you know what's there. So you have access to this, and also recognize because we're going through this great resignation right now and still having it, you have opportunities, you have certain value. They want to keep you, right? So leverage that. Also recognize what other entry-level staffers have done. Look, one of the workers at Amazon was laid off and then was able to unionize the staff. So there's power that you actually have in your entry and junior level staff position, and don't feel that you do not, okay? Then let's get to middle level management, because you are getting crapped on from the top and you're getting complaints from the bottom. And you're like, I don't even know how I'm going to deal with this. So I think what we need to do is we need to do a certain level of reflection, right? So we need to look back and investigate, why did staff leave in the first place? Who was exhibiting a certain level of toxic masculinity that was causing staff to not want to be here, right? And then recognize that. Go back to exit interviews. If you can talk to former people that left, talk to them. If you can go to Glassdoor reviews, but look for those patterns and how you can actually address those patterns so that your staff that is currently experiencing this doesn't have to deal with this anymore, right? Then you have to have hard conversations with your staff, and you have to talk to them and have a real honest conversation. Did we gain your trust or did we lose your trust during this pandemic? What actually happened? Like, a bunch of those news stories that I posted up earlier, what actually happened during that time, right? Who did we actually celebrate? Who did we actually recognize? And did we recognize people that were exhibiting a healthier form of leadership? Are we focused on simply celebrating the individual, or are we focused more on celebrating the team? And then recognize that you have a certain circle of influence. Even if the administration is toxic, even if the departments are toxic, your team doesn't have to be. And if you can show a different way of doing things, where you're experimenting, when you're trying new things out, where you're embracing a more feminine aspect of leadership that is built on play and humanity and compassion and empathy, and that works, and that is where you're making more money, then you can make an argument to everybody else, hey, look, this is working for us. Why don't you try adopting it so that we can all make more money, okay? And then finally, for the executive and C-suite level, we got to ask a really hard question. What is the worst behavior you are currently tolerating? What behavior are you just allowing to run amok? Why are you letting Chad just chill and not do work? Because he's setting the tone for everybody else to also chill and not do work. So what current behavior are you tolerating, and why are you continuing to tolerate that type of behavior? Then we have to really reassess what metrics you are measuring success by? Are we still measuring them by short-term profits, or do we care more about employee retention right now? What are the metrics are we thinking about sustainability and longevity as we're trying to build this organization and build this industry? So we have to really reassess, what are we measuring our success by, and what is actual success? Just making money or being around 10 years from now? And then we have to start funding certain organizations, certain ERGs. So for some people, you may not know these, but there are employee resource groups and these committees that actually form, sometimes organically, that actually address certain issues. So they address certain issues of DEI. They address issues of, like, why do we not have more women leadership currently in the cannabis industry? They address certain issues. And if you create those places and you fund these groups, these might be the only groups where people feel seen, heard, and appreciated. So the more that you're fostering this opportunity for people to express themselves outside of their team, you're creating a space where people can actually share and be heard. And that is another way you can dismantle toxic masculinity. But then I think what we also have to recognize is we have to stop celebrating toxic masculine leaders. Let's stop celebrating the Steve Jobs. There shouldn't be a Steve Jobs of weed, okay? That shouldn't be a goal. You know, I show these because right now there's like 4 series out right now that are celebrating toxic people. If you talk to finance, you talk to hedge fund managers, they love the Wolf of Wall Street. They think that's a hero story, even though that dude went to jail, right? Same thing with WeWork and Dropout and Uber. So we have to stop celebrating this. This is what happened. This is what happened to Mark Zuckerberg. This is what happened to Jeff Bezos, is they fell in love with their own BS. That they were the industry, giants, instead of recognizing that collectively the tech industry built something phenomenal together. Right? And that's the opportunity that the cannabis industry has right now. Are you going to deify certain toxic masculine leaders, or are you going to raise all boats and recognize that we're all doing this together and we're in this together? Okay? And then we need to start challenging. This is a direct action you can actually do to dismantle toxic masculine leadership. You need to start challenging status quo benefits. You need to be offering things that people would not even believe they could have, right? Why not have a 4-day work week? What? Why not start with 4 weeks of paid vacation? Why not have on-site childcare, or pay for someone's student loans, or help them pay for their student loans, or provide them a bonus for actually having a baby instead of punishing them for having a baby, or providing career coaching for entire staff? I know an organization that worked mostly with comedians and actors, and they provided them career coaching. This is a call center. This was just a call center. And these actors and comedians stayed at this call center for years. Because why? Because they provided a career coach that actually allowed them to, as well as the flexibility to go and pursue, their profession while also doing their own job. So these are things that we can actually do to start to dismantle it by bringing in certain benefits that actually watch out for the staff, that actually communicate to the staff. We care about you more than just squeezing as much money out of you until you burn out, right? That we actually want you to be here for the long run and are open to however long you want to stay, but we're going to treat you with a certain level of respect that you actually deserve. This is what you can do in this industry. It's weed, okay? Weed starts with we. There's a reason it's collective. It's built off of this understanding that we're looking out for one another, that we're one with one another. So why would we be incorporating greed and toxic masculine leadership into this industry? That is what I'm warning you about today. So what we are currently at, we are at a crossroads to determine the future of work, right? Where we could just have the business plan of more. Oh, what do we want? We want more money. Okay, what else? We want more market share. Okay, we want to destroy everybody else so that we can have it all, right? That's one model. That is the antiquated model of the past, right? Or we can think about sustainable progress, right? What does post-pandemic leadership look like? It's built off of shared humanity. It's built off of collaboration. It's built off of inspiration and intuition. It's built off of the we over the me. And the more that we can actually look at this in a post-economic growth standpoint, the more we can actually be successful, because we now see that this is not just about our company, and this is not just about our industry, but this is actually the battle for the future of work. How do we want to go back to work? Do we want to do what we've been doing for so long, right? And recognize what actually happened with the Great Resignation, with that many people quitting because they didn't want that anymore? Or are we ready to do something better? Are we ready to have something more complex, a more complex business plan than just more, right? And that is what you have right in front of you. That is the opportunity that you have. So what are you going to do with it? What's going to actually happen? And how are you going to actually address this so that we can actually start to remove toxic masculine leadership from our workplaces so we can go back to work and actually enjoy going back to work again? Because the reality is, like, we don't want to ruin the party for just a few extra dollars. We don't want to do that. And that is what other industries have done. They have sold out and they lost it because they chose greed over the we. They chose me over the we. If you want actual, I actually created a worksheet specifically to actually break this down so that you can take this to your workplace and apply actual steps to address this as the ones that I went. So simply go to rediscoveryourplay.com/G4live in lowercase. And now I am open to taking questions because I know this is a hot topic and there's a lot of questions that we need to actually cover. Okay.